hope it's been a great week for you and looking forward to a wonderful weekend. So, as we step into today's episode of Faithful Friday, I actually want to pick up from a conversation we started back on Monday. So, if you joined us live on Monday or if you had a chance to go back on demand and watch Monday's episode, we talked about the power of visualization. If you caught that episode, actually was sharing the story about Coco Gauff. She was interviewed on Good Morning America this week, following the French Open win over the weekend of last weekend, and she shared this statement in her interview, which was something to the effect. I'm going to paraphrase because I know I'm not going to get it exact, but it was something to this idea of I saw the win before it even happened. She said something like, in my mind, I lifted the trophy before I ever touched it. Okay, so we spent Monday talking about, again, the power of visualization. Like psychology would call that mental rehearsal, like the way in which we can actually practice something in our mind as if it's real, right? As if it's actually happening. And the idea that is called rehearsal is we can practice it or we can play it over and over in our minds. So when it does come time in the real here and now, like when it's actual, not just in our mind, but played out in our lives, right? It somehow feels more natural, or it feels just a little bit easier, and we can step into it with a little bit more confidence. Okay, so that's this idea of cognitive rehearsal and the power of visualization. So I remember finishing that episode, and then somebody reached out to me, and we had a conversation with them. We were kind of debriefing what I had shared in that episode, and they shared with me something to the effect of like, man, I guess I never thought about it, but that's kind of the way faith works. And it was really interesting to sit in that conversation with that person, and like this light bulb went on for them. And to be honest, it kind of went on for me too, right? This idea of faith. And so today we're going to go deeper in that direction. Like we're going to talk about what does it look like for people of faith to leverage the power of visualization. I want to think about it and kind of frame it in this way, like this idea of what does spiritual vision look like? How does that connect with mental rehearsal? And we're going to talk about a little bit today, like how does Scripture invite us to see coming from that idea of vision, how God calls us forward. He calls us towards something, right? Even before we fully see it. All right, so if you just kind of walk with me through this, first of all, I think this faith is first about vision, right? It's about seeing what we can't see. We might use the language of believing what we can't see. I'm going to read this verse from Hebrews chapter 11. Some of you might know it, which is, now faith is a substance of things hoped for, in the evidence of things not seen. It's like exactly what we're talking about, right? The power of visualization, the idea of mental rehearsal, right? Holding on to something that we believe to be there, but we just haven't gotten there yet. Holding on to something that we know we're going to see in the future. And so we're visualizing it, right, in advance, right? This idea of vision is the ability to see something. Now, vision, I think in like actual, like our eyesight vision, I'm thinking about from like the leadership principle of vision, right? This idea of being able to forecast and foresee something ahead of us, right? If you're part of an organization or you've done some work in as an individual, right, might talk about what's the vision for your life? What's the vision for the company or the organization? It's around this idea of like, what's ahead of us? What's it going to look like when we get there? And then being able to depict that, visualize that in a sense, where we are today before we ever get there. So I think for us as Christians, we think about faith is first vision, is at the core. Faith is really around this idea of spiritual visualization or spiritual rehearsal, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. It's about believing in what God has promised us, even if we can't see it yet. Right? That's what that passage in Hebrew is talking about. Right? Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, in the evidence of things not yet seen. So I use that word rehearsal. It's like rehearsing God's faithfulness, so deeply in our minds and in our hearts that we move forward, right? We move in a direction even when the path isn't fully obvious to us. You tracking with me so far? Visualization in psychology is about mental rehearsal. And again, this idea of visualization in faith is really about the idea of spiritual rehearsal. So we're not just rehearsing in our mind, we're rehearsing in our hearts and in our souls, like remembering in our minds, in our hearts, in our souls that God has already spoken over our lives. Right? We hold on to the promises. So I want to give you a couple of examples in this. So let's think about maybe in the Old Testament, the story of Noah. Like there was a promise for Noah, and Noah stepped out in incredible faith before he could see it. So think about this: like Noah didn't wait until he saw the rain come to start to build the ark, right? I mean, some historians say that it took him decades. I mean, like one of the reports, like 120 years or something like that, to with if he had to. He's remember he's in the desert, right? So he had to grow the trees, then he had to harvest the trees, then he had to haul the trees, then he had to be able to actually like split the trees, right? And all of that work, right? Long before he actually saw the rain coming, right? Then he actually had to build an ark, right? And he had to figure out there was no certain there was no Google for that, there was no AI for that, right? There was no manual written for that, right? Little by little, step by step. And all of it was done with visualization, right? This act of incredible faith. God shared with him and God showed him that something was coming. And so he rehearsed, this is cool. He rehearsed obedience like day after day, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, right? Holding on to that promise. So let me give you a couple more examples like this God-given kind of vision, and these might be familiar stories to you. Think about like Abraham, right, where God said to Abraham, He gave him a promise that you're going to be the father of all nations, and he was like, "How in the world is that going to happen?" Remember David, or sorry, Abram and his wife Sarai later became Abraham and Sarah. They didn't have any kids. They couldn't have any kids. And so I remember, the story of Abraham thinking, how in the world am I going to be the father of all nations? Right. And then this idea of when we look up to the sky, it says in scripture that his descendants would be more than the stars, or to look out over the land and it would be greater than the sum of the sand. Right. That just seemed like impossible. But Abraham and Sarah were able to step out in faith. That was like a visual anchor for him, right? To stare at the sky, to look at the sand of the shores, right? God gave them faith based, like mental fortitude, this rehearsal part for them, right? So long before he held his child, his baby in his arms, right? He had this vision. And that's what faith is about. Think about David. David visualized the victory over Goliath, right? Everybody else saw defeat. Everybody else saw this giant that was gonna get him. But David visualized victory. Like he remembered like his when he was younger, right? He remembered the lion. He remembered the bear. He was rehearsing in his mind. God has done this before. God can do this again. He was mentally rehearsing God's deliverance, God's power, and he used that like to face fear, to fuel his faith. Okay, and then think about like Jesus, right? Jesus visualized the joy set before him. There's a passage in Hebrews chapter 12, which comes right after the passage I just shared a moment ago, where it says, the joy set before him, he endured the cross. It's a great passage. I love that in this context, right? He set before him joy, and he endured the cross. Jesus entered not just the physical uh, part of strength that it required, but this spiritual kind of focus. Jesus knew that he had to endure the cross, but he was able to, as the passage says, for the joy set before him, right? He was able to envision what it was going to be like on the other side. He was already in his mind, in his heart, in his soul, right? Coming to that place of great joy, the gift of salvation that was coming, right, through his death and resurrection, right? So he willingly endured the cross. He held this clear vision, right, ahead of him of what the suffering would accomplish, right? This reconciliation, redemption, resurrection. Now, that didn't make it uh, easy or unpainful for him, right? But he was able to, again, hold on to the vision of what was ahead. All right, so I want to talk about, like, what does that look like in our lives? Like, what does faith based visualization look like today? So, I think it's important, first of all, for us to recognize, maybe different than secular psychology, that we recognize that faith based rehearsal and visualization is not manifesting or conjuring up something inside of us. It's not this idea of promoting our own power. It's aligning with God's promises. I think as people of faith, that is foundational to this. Like, we can mentally rehearse God's promises, God's faithfulness, his obedience before we're able to see it. So here's what this might look like. I got a couple examples for you. So, um, like visualizing yourself forgiving, even when bitterness still lingers. Man, just think about how powerful that could be, right? This idea of like, I'm visualizing the work of forgiveness. I'm not, maybe I'm not there yet, right? But I'm working on it. I'm working towards it. I'm willing to visualize myself in it. And even when there's hurt and there's bitterness. How about this? Visualizing yourself stepping into a calling, even when fear whispers to you, hey, you're not ready. It'll never work. You're not enough. Right? If we could step out with faith, like if we could step out with this idea of purpose and meaning and calling, even in the face of fear. How about this one? Visualizing yourself walking in freedom, like rather than or even when shame keeps showing up and tells you otherwise. There's a ton more examples I could share with you, but I think those three that I just referenced starts to really give us this understanding of spiritual visualization, the power that that can have in our lives when we hold on with faith. So we talked about Monday. It's more about process than it is about outcomes, and it's no differently in the conversation we're having today. It's not about controlling the outcomes. It's about continuing to show up, continuing to prepare our heart, our mind, our habits, right? Where we're walking in those every day, right? Like in a way where God has already spoken. He's already showed up, right? He's already done the things that he has promised, even though we can't see them, even if we can't, sense or see it in the right here, in the right now. Okay, so let me give you a practice that you can take into the weekend with you. Okay, so let's think about this as like a spiritual practice, like faithful visualization. So here's what I want you to do with me for a second. I want you to close your eyes. I want you to take a deep breath. I want you to visualize with me. So first is I want you to picture a promise that God has given you. That might be part of what we understand as general revelation, right? This idea that God, through his scripture, has given us a promise. Or maybe it's been, those quiet moments of prayer where you've heard God whisper something to you and given you a promise. Maybe it's through the words of others. God, I'm certain that God uses other people in our lives to speak to us. So maybe there's been a promise spoken to you or over you. So again, with our eyes closed, I just want you to picture a promise that God has given to you. Right? Be as vivid as possible. Right? Hold on to this picture. Okay, and then I want you to just take a moment, like in this pause, to visualize yourself walking in it. Like in a way, like we talked about on Monday, like access your senses. What does it look like and feel like and sound like? Like, what does it look like to live that promise out faithfully? And then I want you to visualize the obstacles. We talked about this on Monday. We talked about it's not just the outcomes, it's the process. And much of our process has obstacles. We talked about the story with Coco Gauff, right? A ton of obstacles, including world-class tennis players, right? That she had to get through at every round to get to the championship, right? And training, like health conditions, stressors in her life, right? We personalize that to our own situations. So in this moment, again, when we're paused here, I want you to visualize obstacles. Obstacles that will show up as you commit to this vision. Right? We're visualizing a promise God has given us. We're visualizing ourselves walking in it. We're visualizing the obstacles that will come along. I also want you to take a moment. I want you to visualize God's presence showing up with you in the midst of those obstacles. And then I want you to do this. Just want you to join me, and we're going to say out loud this statement. And it's simply this: God, I trust you with what you've shown me. Help me walk in it one faithful step at a time. Now, as we just spent a few moments, so open your eyes if you haven't already, going through this, I would encourage you to, whether that was just in this moment, you're able to catch that vision, or maybe you're in a place like maybe you're driving or something else right now where you weren't able to actually do the exercise right here and right now. I want you to go back. I want you to pay attention. I want you to follow these 4 prompts, right? Let me remind you again, it's this: picture a promise that God has given to you. Imagine yourself walking in it. Visualize the obstacles and visualize God's presence with you in the midst of them. And then speak aloud that phrase: God, I trust you for what you've shown me. Help me walk in it one faithful step at a time. So as we wrap up today's time together, and you step into the weekend ahead, and as you step into what God has in store for you in the days to come and into the future, it'd be a great way to practice this. You practice it every day. Like this idea, maybe you're asking yourself this question of like, what's one promise I'm choosing to visualize with faith today? That would be a really cool thing. Where do we start every day? All right, you're waking up, you have your morning routine, and you're just going to say, hey, what's one promise I'm choosing to visualize with faith today? Here's what we know and what we love about the work of faith. Faith gives us permission to see beyond our reality, to be able to see beyond the present and walk in a promise, right? Even when it's not visible, even when we can't see it. So as we kind of connected these over Monday with the power of visualization, today this idea of spiritual visualization, we're connecting the psychology of mental rehearsal, we're pairing that with this idea of spiritual rehearsal. So what does that do? Remember, it's preparing us. It's preparing us. We're practicing over and over and over. Like spiritual rehearsal is something of like our faith preparing our soul for what God has in store. All right, it's been a pleasure to kind of just walk through this. It's been fun for me to connect these two dots. I think it's so important, I think, just on a broader sense, to be able to continually look through the lens. Like I look through these two lenses. One of them is the lens of psychology, the other lens is of theology. Right? We look through parallel lenses of what we have in our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors, what shows up for us. We think about this idea of what's in the present and what's in store in our future. And so when we compare the and bring together, integrate, some of the truths of science to what we know is consistent and aligns to the truths of Scripture, it's really cool. It's really powerful, right? When we can walk in that every day. All right, it's awesome to be with you guys today. Hope you have an incredible weekend. See you back on Monday for our next episode of Mindset Monday.